if anything is a law of physics, or what of the world, it's usually so simple that when you say it out loud, you're like, how can that be a law? I mean, isn't that obvious? One of the rules that's tied to cues is something called Hicks law. Anyone know what Hicks law is? H-I-C-K-S, Hicks law. The more options you have, the longer time it takes to decide. Again, it's like, does that need to be a law? It just seems kind of obvious. But those kinds of rules help me start to understand, what do I want my person to do, my user to do right now? And so when we have a cue, like a sound, and maybe it's like a, and you look at your phone, you pick it up. I've got two things in here. One of them's my Gmail, and one of them's New York Times. If one of them was like an SMS from my wife, I might be more interested in looking at it. But I've had a reaction. I recognize that there were two things there. I've started to evaluate. This happens very, very fast. This is, if it's a cue I've never seen before, this reaction becomes more of a game of recall versus recognition. You can break reaction down. It's nice that they're both with R's too, right? Recall versus recognition. So recognition happens super fast. Recall is accessing your memory a little bit. So something with motion is going to go on the recognition side, because you are hardwired to recognize the difference between something moving and something at rest. You are not hardwired to understand that if you want to navigate to this part of the page, the hamburger button is the way to do it. That's going to take some recall. And so you have to think about it a little bit more. And so a cue, like what I was just going through there, if I have my two messages, I see that nothing is there from my wife, my ability to interact with my notifications on my lock screen, it's pretty easy, and the timing with those two is bad right now. I'm not ready to read about the latest thing to happen in DC, but so the timing for those two interactions, not that good. And the more this is interaction design right here, and this is a huge part where games and UX really interact. Or overlap. So what part of this is UX and what part of this is UI? That's probably where you get into the split the most clear. The cue, coming up with the cue, that's UI work. Evaluating it, that's a usability test, which some might call UX work. Some people might think that their UI work is inherently about picking the right cues, so I don't have to usability test. I mean, there are well-solved problems out there in the UI world that help us understand whether or not, when I click on this thing, am I going to get a drop-down, or am I going to get something else? So there are plenty of cues and parts of our interaction design language that are already out there that people will recognize, and they don't have to think too much about. So this is the UI design. This is a little bit of the UX, and the timing gets a little bit more into the UX. So that's why it's so hard to separate these things, UX and UI, because generation versus evaluation are really where people kind of like might find the definition difference between UX and UI. Okay, so I can't remember his last name, Steven something. Designing for Behavior Change is the name of his book. I remember that. So cue, reaction, evaluation, ability, timing. Any questions on this stuff? Okay. I feel like you can just go on forever and ever evaluating UI. In the way that I got my start in my work was I would reverse engineer some application and try to understand like all of the different parts that it had, all of the different, and I would have to try to use it in weird ways where I would go on airplane mode and try to do a ton of stuff to see if it still worked. But really basically like QA test the entire thing, see what it was doing, and then I tried to recreate it or see if I could model out, okay, if this happens, then this happens, and the user does this, and then this happens, and then this. And now I see a flow, and maybe I say like, you know what? This doesn't really need to happen whatsoever. So I'm going to go back and redesign the queue and try to come up with a better version of that. So let me give you an example. When I was working for Yahoo, we were working on a product that was called, well, it was going to be for the celebrity content, the celebrity news content. There's a bunch of information in there, and it's published pretty frequently. Content comes in there pretty frequently. And so my boss wanted it to be very image heavy, very image centric. That was the way that Yahoo's brand was going at the time. And so I get this direction from my boss, Kratos has a kid, so make a kid. And so what I had to do then was basically start to enumerate all of this content that I have to work with. The interactions that we were interested in getting in there had to do with there was a chat application that never really launched that was going to be the backbone of pretty much every application. So whether you're in finance, celebrity, sports, whatever, there is some sort of chat that you might be able to have within those different applications, and that was going to be tied to your identity. Marissa had some cool dreams and ideas, but I guess Oath is where we are now. Anyway, so what I have is a mobile interface with some images, right? And celebrity news probably doesn't have trees in there, but that's what that is. Here's a person. That's the celebrity news. And so I'm thinking, okay, feeds of content. People go through these a lot. This is a queue that people get. They swipe up and down through content quite a bit. And if I mess with something that's innate, like motion, one of those things is symmetry. Symmetry helps you understand part to whole. It's part of Gestalt psychology. It gets deep into like how do people process what they're looking at and then make a decision about it. And if I have a piece of content here that ends like this, I'm not playing with symmetry whatsoever right there. And aside from the fact that this one is shorter than this one, maybe there could be content below it. But for the most part, like you're seeing this padding down here, you might be looking at the entire interface. But and this was part of Apple's old human interface guidelines, was to play with symmetry. And so we have something that looked like this. Okay, so what is the interaction that happens on here? Everyone hold your phone with one hand and then perform the interaction that happens to navigate this content. Okay, we got it. We got some thumbs going. All right, now imagine this is an X and Y axis. And how many of you do you think were able to perform that vertical swipe on only the Y axis? And there's no X-axis information whatsoever. It would be these screens are too good to detect subtle variations and things like that. So it's coming through. I go to my developer and I ask her, hey, does a regular list view in Android and iOS, does that just suppress X-axis information? Or does that, like how does that translate in there? And she says, yeah, actually it does. It is suppressed, but it helps to determine the kind of momentum that you get when you swipe in these things. And so if you're swiping kind of like this, it's not going to go up very high. And if you swipe, kind of a curve, it might, depending on how fast you were doing it, it'll pick up some momentum and go with it. So I'm thinking, okay, so the queue is this feed. Their reaction is to swipe up on it. And their evaluation is probably along the lines of like, was it swiping up? Did it do what I was thinking it would do? And so what I wanted to do was latch on to that interaction. Here's something that someone's already doing, and how can I latch on to that interaction and make it do something else? As opposed to creating some whole new queue where there might be like a, here's a person and there's like a share button or like a, flag this post or something like that. Instead of having the UI exposed like that, I wondered, can I translate some of this information, and as that swipe happens, start to let that object, wherever they touched, if the touch began here and they swipe up, maybe you start to show this card interpret some of that x-axis information, and it starts to move along with them. And as soon as you let go, it snaps back into place. And so that's my cue. My cue is interpret some of the x-axis information by showing this thing kind of move along with the finger as the touch event occurs. And so I go into a prototyping tool that I was using at the time. It was called, I think, Pixate. It doesn't exist anymore, but you can recreate it with, well, prototyping tools is a whole nother discussion. I won't get into that now. So I prototyped it, I made it. You know, I learned from asking my developer some stuff. She told me some stuff. I made something. I showed it to some people, and what I put inside of it, what I showed him was just, you know, it was just pictures of whatever. And I said, you know, look at this new feed of content. What do you think? I didn't say anything about try to swipe it left and right a little bit when you go. And so, sure enough, when people were playing with it, I found that the tension on some of it was a little too tight. So I go back to the prototype, loosen it up a little bit, and then people find it a little bit more, you know, a little easier. And if my boss you know, if this is all tied to, you know, you swipe this thing, you reveal some controls, or you swipe, and if you go the way that this thing ended up working was if you swiped past a certain threshold with that card, the rest of the UI in the background would fade out, and then you would get some options